In the summer of 1991, Sheriff William Hargrove had already been working in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades. At 48, he was a well-respected figure in the tight-knit community of Cedar Creek County. Known for his no-nonsense approach, Hargrove knew every winding back road and could name nearly every local. The county itself, nestled along the Kentucky-Virginia border, was a rugged expanse of dense woods and steep ravines, a land shaped by generations of isolation. The call came in just after midnight on June 12. A hunter had found an abandoned car parked on a rarely used Forest Service road near the county line. Following standard procedure, Hargrove decided he would check it out himself. Over the years, Hargrove had handled countless cases of abandoned vehicles, usually just the result of drunk teens, lost tourists, or the occasional person who had strayed too far into the woods. It was nearly 1 a.m. when his cruiser finally made its way up the narrow dirt road. His headlights illuminated a blue sedan, parked at an odd angle, its driver's door hanging wide open. The dome light flickered faintly inside the car. Hargrove noticed the battery was nearly drained. He shined his flashlight around, taking in the scene. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing that immediately raised alarm, except for the location itself. The car was registered to a Daniel Harper, a man from Greensboro, which was more than 3 hours away. Inside the vehicle, Hargrove found a map, a nearly empty water bottle, and a notebook with several coordinates written inside. The coordinates pointed to remote locations deep in the forests, areas that crossed the borders of both counties, with land belonging to a mix of federal preserves and old family estates. Hargrove called in the Discovery, reporting the vehicle and asking dispatch for any information on Harper. The response was strange. Harper had no criminal history. He was 42, a geology professor at Appalachian State University. By morning, still no sign of Harper. So Hargrove arranged for a search party. Harper wife reported that her husband had been researching old mining sites in the area, but he was supposed to have returned 2 days earlier. 6 hours into the search, they found Harper. Backpacked beside a steep ravine, its contents untouched. The search expanded over the next 3 days, but still no sign of Harper. No body, no blood, and no other personal belongings. What unsettled Hargrove most was the location of the backpack. The coordinates in Harper notebook led to areas where, in previous years, hikers had gone missing. At the time, those disappearances were chalked up to bad terrain, wild animals, or people getting lost. There was no connection, at least not one anyone could see, until now. A week into the investigation, Hargrove received an unexpected package. It was addressed to the sheriff of Cedar Creek County, with no return address or signature. Inside, he found a VHS tape and a typed note. Found this in my father's things after he passed. He worked for the Forest Service from 1978 to 1994. I think you should see it. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Hargrove sat alone in his office and played the tape. The grainy footage showed Forest Service workers documenting a strange find. It appeared to be an old mining tunnel, its entrance partially collapsed. The time stamp on the footage read July 1983, 8 years prior. The camera panned as the workers cleared the debris, revealing crude wooden supports and narrow tunnels that descended into darkened depths. The footage cut off abruptly, then resumed from inside the tunnel. The workers discussed unusual rock formations, with one commenting on the unnatural symmetry of the tunnel's design. At the 17-minute mark, the camera panned across the chamber. The walls were covered with strange symbols etched into the stone, symbols that clearly weren't related to mining operations. One of the Forest Service geologists appeared visibly unsettled, stating, "These aren't from the 1920s operations. These are much older." In the final moments of the footage, the workers discovered a small opening leading to another chamber. As they widened the gap, the camera caught a fleeting glimpse of the floor, where scattered bones were visible. The tape cut off abruptly, ending with someone shouting, "Get out!" Hargrove sat motionless. The only sound in his office was the static from the TV. The coordinates from Harper notebook lined up perfectly with the location shown in the footage. The next morning, Hargrove drove to the Forest Service's regional office. Susan Brown, the records supervisor, had worked there for 30 years. She turned pale when Hargrove mentioned the 1983 tunnel exploration. "That site's been sealed," she said flatly. "By federal order." When Hargrove pressed for more details, she hesitated, then retrieved a thin file. According to the documents, the tunnel had been sealed because it was deemed unsafe. There was no mention of bones or symbols in the report. The names of the workers in the video were listed. All had moved to different districts or retired. Except one, Frank Bennett, who had died in a hiking accident in 1984, less than a year after the footage was taken. Susan leaned in, her voice lowering to a whisper. "People talk about those woods. They always have. The old families won't go near certain places. There's a history there that doesn't make it into official reports," she added. Hargrove spent the next week quietly investigating, poring over missing persons reports spanning decades. He found 23 cases within a 10-mile radius of the coordinates Harper had recorded, stretching over the past 40 years. Most of the cases were categorized as accidents, exposure, or simply people getting lost, hikers, campers, a few locals who should have known better. But a pattern was beginning to form. 13 days after Harper disappearance, Hargrove received a call from the sheriff in the neighboring county. While hiking near the county line, a man stumbled upon a camera hanging from a tree branch. When the film was developed, it revealed 11 photos. The first 9 were of various rock formations, clearly taken by Harper. The 10th picture showed a tunnel entrance, barely visible through the thick foliage. The 11th was blurry, but it unmistakably depicted a human figure hiding in the trees, tall, thin, and wearing ragged clothes. Hargrove quickly organized a new search, enlisting officers from both neighboring counties. They managed to pinpoint the tunnel entrance from the photo, which had been concealed under dense brush. The site had recently been disturbed, with federal seals that had once marked it now broken. Inside, they found Harper. Wallet, keys, and a single boot about 50 yards into the tunnel. Further in, the tunnel split into several branches. The team spent hours searching but found nothing more than old mining gear and collapsed sections. In the deepest part of the tunnel, Hargrove's flashlight revealed strange symbols etched into the walls, identical to those from the video. As he snapped photos, his radio crackled with static. A faint voice came through. "William, get out now." It was his deputy, guarding the tunnel's entrance. Seconds later, a gunshot rang out through the darkness. The team rushed back to find the deputy, eyes wide and gun drawn. "There's something out there," he said, his voice trembling. "Right at the edge of the trees. It didn't move like anything natural." That night, while going through the photos, Hargrove noticed something no one else had seen. Behind one of the symbols, almost hidden, was a narrow crack in the wall. It seemed just wide enough for someone to slip through. The following day, Hargrove returned with 3 officers. They found the crack and widened it enough to get through. On the other side, they came across a chamber that was unlike the rest of the mine. Its walls were smooth, and the ceiling rose higher. In the center of the room, there was a crude stone table, surrounded by both animal and human bones, old and new. Among the remains, they found Daniel Harper's missing boot, his watch, and his wedding ring. The investigation that followed became the most extensive in the county's history. The FBI arrived, anthropologists examined the bones, and the tunnels were mapped in detail. Some of the bones were over a century old, while others were much more recent. They were later identified as belonging to 3 hikers who had disappeared in the area, one in 2013, another in 2014, and the third in 1990. But despite all their efforts, Harper himself was never found, nor was the person responsible for the remains. The official report suggested the site had been used by a serial killer who likely operated for decades, using the remote mine to hide his victims. The case remains unsolved, with no suspects. Sheriff Hargrove retired the next year due to health reasons. Before leaving office, he sealed his personal case notes, instructing that they should only be opened upon his death. When those notes were finally made public after Hargrove passed away in 2016, he wrote, "What we uncovered goes beyond the work of a single killer. The symbols we found don't match any known language, yet they appear on rocks throughout the woods, some of them carved centuries ago, according to anthropologists. Local families have legends about creatures watching from the trees, stories that stretch back to the time of the first settlers. The oldest bones in the chamber were there long before the mine ever existed, by at least 50 years. Whatever it is that watches over those woods, it's still out there. I've seen it twice since we sealed the tunnel, once while driving on County Road 17 and once from outside my bedroom window. Tall. Unnaturally thin. Patient. The FBI can call it the work of a serial killer, but those of us who have lived here all our lives know better. This land was never really ours to claim. We just pretend it is." The tunnel was sealed again, this time with concrete, and guarded around the clock until the work was completed. The forest has slowly overtaken the area, and most locals steer clear of it entirely. Every few years, another abandoned car is found near the county line. Sometimes belongings are recovered. But the people? They're never found. Sheriff Stephen Brooks's cruiser rolled to a stop, its headlights shining on the worn sign. "Welcome to Ravenswood County, population 16,742. After 14 years as a homicide detective in Cincinnati, Brooks had traded the madness of city life for the quiet of rural Virginia, accepting the sheriff's job in this small, tucked-away county nestled in the Smoky Mountain Mountains. He had hoped the change would be a fresh start after a tough divorce and the grind of urban policing. Fewer murders, more missing pets, and the occasional neighborly squabble. By June 2003, just 6 months into the role, Brooks had settled into a smooth routine. The locals had warmed to him, appreciative of his professionalism and his disinterest in the small-town politics that often plagued rural areas. The county's crime rate was just as he had hoped, manageable. A few property crimes, occasional domestic disturbances, and random DUIs. Then came the first disappearance. Sarah Dawson, 29, never showed up for Sunday dinner at her mother's house. Her car was discovered the next morning on Highway 16. A secluded stretch of road that locals referred to as the back way. The car had a flat tire, but there were no signs of a struggle. Sarah's purse sat on the passenger seat, her cell phone inside it, showing several missed calls from her worried mother. The search lasted 5 days, with volunteers scouring the thick woods on both sides of the road while Brooks worked with state police to coordinate the effort. When Sarah was finally located, 3 miles from her car and deep within the forest, there was no visible cause of death. No gunshot wounds, no stab marks, and no blunt force trauma. The medical examiner concluded she died from exposure after becoming disoriented while wandering away from her vehicle. It was a heartbreaking accident, but not an unusual one for the rough, rugged terrain. Still, Brooks couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something didn't add up. Why would Sarah, someone who had lived here her whole life, wander so far from the road? Why wouldn't she simply follow the highway to the nearest house, just a couple of miles away? The case file sat untouched on his desk longer than it should have, before he finally filed it away reluctantly. 3 weeks later, it happened again. This time, it was John Bennett, a salesman from Richmond. His rental car was found on the same stretch of highway, the keys still in the ignition, and the engine running. Search teams found John 4 days later, 2 miles from his car, but in the opposite direction from where Sarah had been discovered. Again, there were no signs of violence. The medical examiner's conclusion: death by exposure and dehydration. By the time the third disappearance occurred, involving a college student returning home for the summer, Brooks couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. All 3 vehicles had been found within a 5-mile stretch of Highway 16. Each victim had wandered into the woods, instead of staying with their vehicle or following the road to safety, decisions that defied basic survival instincts. And all 3 had died from exposure, despite the fact that the weather conditions shouldn't have caused such fatal outcomes in such a short period of time. When Brooks began looking into previous incidents along that stretch of road, the county clerk, Martha Lawson, gave him a peculiar look. "You're not the first to notice this," she said quietly, pulling out files that dated back to 1974. "Every few years, someone goes missing out there. Most of them are written off as accidents or exposure," she continued. The records revealed 12 similar cases over 29 years, all within the same 10-mile radius. All were ruled accidental deaths. All the victims had been found in the woods, having apparently abandoned their working vehicles or left the highway for no clear reason. Brooks brought in state investigators, but they found no concrete answers. The FBI reviewed the cases, but they couldn't find enough evidence of foul play to justify federal involvement. And so, the highway remained open, essential, even, for connecting the county's more remote communities. Then, in late September, after the fourth disappearance that year, Brooks received an unexpected visitor. Harold Garrison, the former sheriff who had retired after 22 years of service, was now in his 70s. His once sturdy frame had been bent by age, but he still carried an air of authority. "Heard you've been looking into the highway incidents," Garrison said, settling heavily into the chair across from Brooks's desk. "I thought you might want to know about the investigation we did back in '87. Garrison continued. He explained that after 3 disappearances that year, they had set up continuous patrols along Highway 16. For 6 weeks, officers monitored the area around the clock. Nothing happened during the surveillance period. But the day after the patrols ended, a local farmer vanished while driving home from town. His truck was found, parked at the now familiar stretch of highway. 4 days later, his body was found 3 miles into the woods. "We never figured out what was behind it," Garrison admitted. "But we did find something strange. Every single one of the victims had stopped their vehicles voluntarily. There were no signs of accidents or mechanical issues, and in some cases, they even found footprints around the vehicles that didn't belong to the victims." "You think someone was targeting them?" Brooks asked. "Maybe," Garrison said, leaning in closer. "But here's the part that really got to me. In 2 cases, we found other cars parked nearby around the estimated time of disappearance. There were witnesses who should have seen something, but they reported nothing unusual. Just an empty vehicle on the side of the road. No struggling victim. No suspicious person. Nothing." That night, Brooks decided to take a trip to the highway by himself. The road cut through thick forests, with steep ravines dropping off on one side and dense woods rising on the other. Cell reception was spotty at best. Even during the day, the isolation was palpable. At night, the darkness between the occasional streetlights felt suffocating. Brooks parked his cruiser in the center of the 5-mile stretch where most of the vehicles had been found. He turned off his lights, leaving the engine running, and watched the road and the surrounding forest. Around midnight, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. A sedan slowed as it approached, then pulled off onto the shoulder about 50 yards behind him. Brooks watched in his side mirror as the driver's door opened, and a middle-aged man stepped out. The man glanced at his front tire, then pulled out a cell phone, likely checking for a signal. When he didn't find one, the man leaned against his car and seemed to settle in, apparently waiting. Brooks was about to make his presence known when the man suddenly stood up straight, staring into the woods. He took several steps toward the tree-line, head tilted, as if listening for something. Then, inexplicably, the man began walking into the forest. Brooks quickly grabbed his flashlight and radio, calling for backup as he exited his vehicle. "Sir, Sheriff's Department," Brooks shouted. But the man kept walking, moving with an unnerving steadiness, as though he had no trouble navigating the uneven terrain or the darkness. Despite Brooks's best efforts to catch up, the man never stumbled, never looked back. When Brooks was only 20 feet away, the man suddenly veered behind a large oak tree. By the time Brooks reached the spot, the man had vanished. The forest floor showed no sign of which direction he had taken. Brooks's flashlight cut through the thick darkness, its beam scanning the trees and underbrush, but revealing nothing. He called out repeatedly, his voice bouncing off the trunks of the surrounding trees. There was no answer. 15 minutes later, backup arrived, and the search resumed. They combed a 1-mile radius from where Brooks had last seen the man, but found no trace. No footprints leading beyond the tree. No broken branches or signs of passage. The only evidence that the man had ever been there was his still-running vehicle, parked on the highway. Inside the car, they found a wallet identifying the driver as Stephen Thornton, a 47-year-old from Ashford. His cell phone revealed 3 unsuccessful attempts to make calls after he had stopped. Other than that, everything seemed normal in the vehicle. The search for Thornton went on for 6 days, but his body was never found. The incident gnawed at Brooks. He had been less than 20 feet away, yet somehow, he had lost sight of a grown man in the open woods. The impossibility of it haunted him. 2 weeks later, he pushed for traffic cameras to be installed along that stretch of the highway, a move that required special approval due to the high cost for such a rural county. By mid-November, the cameras were up and running. For 3 months, everything seemed quiet. Then, in February 2004, the first camera captured something unusual. At around 9:15 p.m., a pickup truck pulled off the road. The driver, later identified as local construction worker Gary Preston, got out and seemed to speak to someone just off camera. He then walked into the woods and disappeared from sight. When officers arrived about 30 minutes later, after receiving an automated alert about the abandoned truck, they found Preston's vehicle with the engine still running. The camera footage showed no one else on the scene, either before or after Preston's arrival. Brooks requested forensic analysis of the area where Preston had appeared to be speaking to someone. The results were telling. There were no footprints except for Preston's own. Whatever had lured him into the woods left no trace behind. In response, Brooks made the rare decision to close the highway at night. Warning signs were placed at both ends, Highway 16. Closed from sunset to sunrise. Use alternate routes. Local residents weren't happy about the inconvenience, but Brooks stuck to his decision. For a while, no more disappearances occurred. But 6 months later, under pressure from the county board and with no new incidents to justify the closure, the highway was reopened to night traffic. Within 2 weeks, another vehicle was discovered abandoned. The pattern continued intermittently, stretching into the present day. Now retired, Brooks still lives in Ravenswood County. He refuses to drive on Highway 16, no matter the circumstances, and has put together an extensive file on the disappearances, 29 cases spanning 47 years. The official explanation for the disappearances remains unchanged. People experiencing car trouble become disoriented and wander into the forest. But those who live here know better. They avoid the highway after dark. And if they must drive it, they follow one simple rule: whatever you see or hear, do not stop the car. Sheriff Brooks's personal files contain one final note. Something hunts on that road. It leaves no footprints, disturbs no ground, and can make you walk willingly to your death. I saw it happen. I was 20 feet away, and I couldn't stop it. The highway is open once more, and people continue to disappear. Sheriff Daniel Reeves had always prided himself on his ability to judge people's character. After 23 years of law enforcement in rural Montana, his instincts were finely tuned, making the Richard Scott case all the more disturbing. Riverbend County stretched across 3,500 square miles of mountains, forests, and scattered towns, where everyone knew everyone. As sheriff, Reeves made it a point to connect with the community. He knew the troublemakers, the good-hearted folks, and most importantly, the ordinary people who made up the county's heart. Richard Scott had moved to the area in the spring of 2008, buying a modest 2-story house on 5 acres just outside the town of Meadowbrook. A retired accountant from Portland in his early 60s, Scott quickly became a fixture in town life. He joined the local historical society, volunteered at the library, and attended town council meetings. Quiet, soft-spoken, and friendly, he was well-liked, often bringing homemade cookies to community events. In the 3 years since his arrival, he hadn't even gotten a speeding ticket. That changed on October 17, 2011. The call came in at 7:13 a.m. A hiker had found a shallow grave in the woods about 4 miles from town. By 8 a.m., Reeves was standing over the freshly uncovered remains of what appeared to be a young woman. The state crime lab was on its way, but it would be hours before they arrived, given the remote location. Initial examination suggested the body had been in the grave for about 2 weeks. The grave was shallow but methodically prepared, lined with plastic sheeting and topped with a layer of lime powder. This wasn't a hasty burial. It was calculated. Within 3 days, the victim was identified as 26-year-old Elizabeth Harper, a waitress who had disappeared from a neighboring county 17 days earlier. Her car had been found abandoned at a popular trailhead, leading investigators to believe she had met with an accident in the wilderness. But the discovery of her body, showing clear signs of strangulation, shifted the investigation to homicide. What unsettled Reeves the most was the location of the grave. The grave had been placed in an isolated area, accessible only by a rugged logging road, followed by a half-mile hike through thick woods. Whoever buried her there knew the land intimately, understanding it would be a difficult spot to reach and rarely visited, especially in October when most hikers stayed home. Only someone familiar with the terrain would have chosen such a secluded location. After a week of little progress, Reeves decided to conduct a detailed search around the burial site. It was during this search that Deputy Collins made a discovery that changed the course of the investigation: a weathered trail camera affixed to a tree about 60 yards from the grave. Trail cameras were common in the area, mostly used by hunters to track wildlife. What made this camera odd was its location, far removed from any hunting grounds. After retrieving the memory card, the investigators reviewed the footage and were stunned by what they found: images spanning nearly 3 years, each taken at 2-week intervals. The camera had been set to capture a photo every 14 days at precisely 3 a.m. Most of the photos showed nothing but dark woods. Occasionally, deer or other animals appeared, but then, in April 2011, something unusual showed up. A figure in dark clothing began appearing in the images, always in the distance, sometimes carrying tools. The quality of the night shots was poor, making it impossible to clearly identify the figure. Then came October 1, 2011, a clear image of the figure, illuminated by the camera's flash, holding a shovel and standing near what would become Elizabeth Harper's grave. Though the face was obscured by a hat, Reeves instantly recognized Richard Scott. The following morning, a search warrant was served on Scott property. What they found was beyond anything Reeves had feared. In a hidden compartment behind a false wall in the basement, investigators found dozens of journals documenting Scott's activities over the last 2 decades. These journals, detailing his life in 4 different states, included accounts of 7 murders, with photographs of the victims both before and after their deaths. What was even more disturbing was the meticulous documentation of how Scott stalked, monitored, and planned the abductions. The journals described in unnervingly precise detail how Scott selected his victims, how he followed them for months, studying their routines, and how he eventually abducted them. One chilling entry stood out to Reeves. "Watched MC again today, 3rd time this week. She smiles at everyone, doesn't know I exist, doesn't know I'm watching. They never do." In the attic, investigators found a makeshift darkroom where Scott had developed thousands of photographs. Pictures of unsuspecting people going about their daily lives. Some were shopping, some were walking dogs, others were simply working. Many of the people in the photos were locals, people Reeves knew personally. Some photos had been taken through windows at night, others in the yards or driveways of the victims. There were even photos of Reeves himself, at crime scenes, in the grocery store, mowing his lawn and washing his car. The more they dug, the more disturbing the discoveries became. In a locked shed behind the house, investigators found a collection of items that had been taken from the victims: jewelry, driver's licenses, and credit cards. Among these items was a pendant necklace belonging to Elizabeth Harper, still sealed in an evidence bag. That's when the realization hit Reeves like a physical blow. He recognized the distinctive evidence bags that could only come from his department's evidence room. A deeper investigation into Scott's background revealed a shocking truth: Richard Scott wasn't his real name. In 2007, Scott had assumed a new identity. Before that, He had gone by Richard Scott, Ronald Overton, and Stevenman Olson, each name lasting only a few years before he moved on to the next. His fingerprints matched those of Timothy Harper, a former evidence technician with the Portland Police Department who had disappeared in 1994 after being questioned about missing evidence. Harper had been a suspect in a string of unsolved murders but had been cleared due to a lack of evidence. In a hidden compartment in Scott's desk, investigators found visitor passes to various police departments across 4 states, volunteer badges for law enforcement-run community programs, and several police scanners programmed to local frequencies. For over 20 years, Scott had been living in plain sight, blending into communities, gaining trust, and establishing relationships with local law enforcement. He had attended the same church as one of Reeves' deputies. He had been at the sheriff's annual summer barbecue. He even volunteered to photograph the department's charity softball game the previous year. The most chilling discovery came when they found notes detailing the Harper investigation. Notes that could only have come from someone with access to case files or briefings. Scott had been tracking the investigation into his own crime, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. When questioned, Scott remained eerily calm and almost amused. "You passed me in the grocery store last Tuesday," Scott said, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I could tell you were worried about something. I saw the frown on your face as you looked at the cereal boxes. I was standing right next to you, and you never even noticed me." As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Scott was responsible for at least 11 murders across Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Oregon over the past 2 decades. In every case, he had quietly integrated into the community, often developing close ties with local law enforcement through volunteer work or community involvement. The trail camera, which had captured his image, was his ultimate mistake. It wasn't placed by hunters, as initially thought. Evidence suggested that another hiker had noticed the disturbed ground near the grave site and set up the camera, but never returned to retrieve it or report any findings. Despite a thorough search, no additional remains were found in the area. During Scott's trial, the prosecution laid out evidence of his cold, methodical approach to murder. For each victim, he created detailed surveillance files, studying their routines and habits. He meticulously rehearsed his actions, timing his entries and exits from their homes with precision. He selected burial sites years ahead of time, preparing them over time with repeated visits. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of his behavior was how he inserted himself into the investigations. He attended community meetings about the missing persons, volunteered for search parties, and in some cases, even approached investigators, offering helpful information. Psychological evaluations painted Scott as the textbook psychopath, with narcissistic tendencies. He viewed his killings as intellectual challenges, seeing them as puzzles to solve through careful planning and flawless execution. His ability to move unnoticed through communities, to blend in while plotting violence, was something he took great pride in. "The trick," he told one psychiatrist, "is to be ordinary enough to be trusted, but forgettable enough to disappear in plain sight. I've stood in line behind officers who were investigating me. I've held doors open for detectives carrying my case files. None of them ever noticed him. Not really." Scott was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. 3 years later, he died in prison, taking the locations of his other victims with him. For Sheriff Reeves, the case had a profound impact. The man who had attended his department cookouts, volunteered at the county fair booth, and had even been approved to work with children's reading programs at the library was a hidden predator. "We look for the threat at the periphery," Reeves later wrote in an article for a law enforcement journal. "We watch the shadows, the strangers, the obvious dangers. Scott taught me that sometimes the greatest threat is sitting across from you at the coffee shop, wearing a friendly smile and asking about your family." Scott didn't hide in the darkness. He hid in the light, in plain sight, counting on our natural tendency to trust what we perceive as familiar. Before retiring in 2018, Reeves developed a training program for rural law enforcement. This program focused on identifying predators like Scott, individuals who understand small-town dynamics and exploit community trust to facilitate their crimes. The program, now used in police academies across 17 states, is called the Watchman Protocol, named after a chilling line from Scott journals. "I'm not just watching them. I'm watching those who think they're watching out for them. I see the sheriff drive by my house every morning at 7:15. He waves. I wave back. He thinks he's the watchman of this town. He doesn't realize I'm watching him." Some of the evidence photos recovered from Scott home remained sealed under court order due to their disturbing content. Among them were hundreds of images of unsuspecting officers, photographed while eating lunch, pumping gas, shopping with their families, captured by a killer they never noticed standing right next to them. Sheriff Isabella Martinez had seen a lot in her 22 years in law enforcement, the last 7 spent as the sheriff of Pinewood County. But nothing had prepared her for the case that would come to define her career. The Ravenswood case was unlike anything she had encountered before. It changed the way she saw the world and made her question everything about the ordinary. Pinewood County sat in a quiet corner of rural Oregon, where dense forests gave way to small towns and scattered farms. Isabella had grown up here, left to attend the police academy, and returned to raise her family amidst the safety of these mountains. The county had its share of small crimes, domestic disputes, occasional burglaries, drug offenses, but nothing had prepared Isabella for what would be discovered at 1421 Silent Valley Road. The first call came on a Tuesday morning in April 2016. Ellen Ravenswood, a 37-year-old high school English teacher, reported hearing strange noises in her house. The dispatcher logged it as a routine check, no real cause for concern. Deputy Lawson responded, investigated, and found nothing suspicious. He filed it away as a possible raccoon in the attic, a standard response. But 3 days later, Ellen called again. This time, she reported that things in her home had been moved. Small, seemingly insignificant items, but they were enough to unnerve her. A coffee mug had been moved to a different shelf. A book was turned upside down, even though she always used bookmarks. Her hairbrush had been shifted to the opposite side of the bathroom sink. Deputy Lawson checked for signs of forced entry, found none, and suggested she change her locks. But by the third call, a week later, Isabella decided to handle it herself. Ellen was well respected in the community, never one to make a fuss, and Isabella trusted her instincts that something wasn't right. When Isabella arrived at the modest 2-story house tucked away among towering pines, Ellen appeared exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at sleepless nights. "I know how this sounds," Ellen said as she led Isabella through the house. "But someone is coming into my home. They're touching my things. Sometimes I hear noises at night, footsteps, not just the house settling. I've lived here for 4 years. I know the sounds of my house," Ellen insisted. Isabella conducted a careful search of the property. The house was old, built in the 1930s, with multiple expansions over the decades that created a somewhat maze-like layout. The basement was only partially finished, with one section still consisting of rough concrete and fieldstone. A thorough inspection revealed no signs of forced entry or unauthorized access. "Consider installing a security system," Isabella suggested. "Motion-activated lights, a camera doorbell. I'll have a deputy patrol the area regularly for the next few weeks." Ellen nodded, but her gaze remained uneasy. "What if they're already inside?" The question lingered in Isabella's mind as she left. By all standards, this was a classic case of an overwrought homeowner, yet something about Ellen's quiet certainty made Isabella uneasy. 3 weeks passed without incident. Isabella had nearly forgotten the case when Ellen called the station directly, bypassing 911. Her voice was barely audible. "Someone was in my bedroom last night, while I was sleeping. I woke up and could feel them standing there. When I turned on the light, no one was there. But the closet door was open. I always keep it closed." Isabella arrived at the house 20 minutes later with 2 deputies in tow. This time, they conducted an exhaustive search, inspecting every closet, crawl space, and storage area. They moved furniture, checked behind it, and even scoured the attic. As they prepared to leave, frustrated and without answers, Deputy Marshal called from the basement. "Sheriff, you need to see this." In the unfinished section of the basement, Marshall had noticed something strange about one of the walls. The fieldstone foundation looked solid, but when he pushed on one section, it shifted slightly. Upon closer inspection, he found a cleverly concealed panel that blended seamlessly with the surrounding stone. When they opened the panel, a narrow passage appeared, leading into a deep, dark space. "Get Ellen out of the house," Isabella ordered Marshall. "Call for backup, and get the state police here." The passage led to a hidden room buried deep within the walls of the house. Inside, there were signs of long-term occupation. A thin mattress, bottled water, packaged food, a chemical toilet, and, most unsettling of all, several personal items belonging to Ellen. Hairbrushes with strands of her hair, old clothing, and photographs taken through windows or doorways, showing her in different rooms of her home. On one wall, there was a crude diagram of the house's layout, complete with notes about Ellen's daily activities: when she showered, when she slept, which stairs creaked, and which doors were rarely opened. The occupant had been living in Ellen's house for at least 6 months, entering and exiting through a hidden entrance that led into a storm drain at the edge of the property. The investigation that followed uncovered something even more disturbing. The house's peculiar architecture had not been the result of random additions over the years. It had been deliberately designed with hidden passages, peepholes, and secret rooms by the original owner, Edmund Ravenswood, Ellen's great-uncle. County records revealed that Edmund had built the house in 1932 and lived there until his death in 1979. A reclusive contractor, he had built or renovated at least 11 other homes in the area. Ellen, who inherited the house after her parents died, had no knowledge of the hidden spaces. She had grown up in Portland and only visited the house occasionally as a child. The family had rented the house out for decades before Ellen moved in after taking a job at the local high school. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators identified the occupant of the hidden room through fingerprints and DNA. Jacob Bennett, 42, had been a student of Edmund Ravenswood's building techniques as a teenager, helping the aging contractor with various projects. After Edmund's death, Jacob had continued studying the old man's architectural drawings and journals, which contained detailed plans for what Edmund had called observation spaces, hidden areas from which the house's residents could be secretly watched. For nearly 30 years, Jacob had lived intermittently in houses built or renovated by Edmund, moving from one location to the next, using his knowledge of the secret passages to gain access. Jacob knew the hidden entrances, the concealed observation points, the spaces that no one else knew existed. Even more chilling was the discovery of Jacob's journal, found in a waterproof container in the hidden room. The journal detailed not just Ellen's activities, but those of previous tenants as well, monitoring their routines, conversations, and private moments. One entry, dated several years earlier, read, "They never look up. Even when they feel something, they look at doors and windows. They never think about the spaces between walls, the eyes watching from above." As the investigation expanded to other properties Ravenswood had worked on, 7 more homes were found to contain similar hidden rooms. While none were occupied at the time, 3 of the homeowners had experienced strange occurrences similar to Ellen's. Objects moved, unexplained noises, a sense of being watched, but they had dismissed them as nothing more than imagination or simple misfortune. Jacob was arrested at his workplace, a hardware store where he had been employed for 15 years. Co-workers described him as quiet, friendly, and unremarkable. He lived alone in a small apartment, and had no criminal record aside from a minor speeding ticket. No one in his public life ever suspected the darkness he harbored. During interrogation, Jacob showed no remorse. His detached, clinical descriptions of his actions suggested he viewed them as nothing more than a hobby. "People are most interesting when they think they're alone," he told investigators. "You can never truly know someone until you've watched them, when they think no one's looking." Jacob's words echoed with an unsettling calm. Edmund Ravenswood understood this better than anyone. He designed his houses as tools for observation. I just carried on his work, Jacob said without hesitation. When asked about his focus on Ellen, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. She sings to herself when she thinks no one's listening. I wanted to hear more songs. A psychiatric evaluation revealed Jacob's deep disorders, voyeuristic tendencies mixed with schizoid personality disorder. He showed no remorse for his actions, viewing his victims as objects of study, not as real people whose privacy he had violated. What was even more troubling was Jacob's insistence that he hadn't physically harmed anyone. I just wanted to watch and listen, he insisted, despite evidence that he had sometimes drugged his victims' food or drinks to keep them unconscious during his midnight intrusions. He was convicted of felony burglary, stalking, illegal surveillance, and invasion of privacy. His sentence? 25 years with no chance for parole. For Sheriff Isabella Martinez, this case reshaped how she saw the homes in her county. The idea that houses could contain hidden, watching eyes made what seemed like regular buildings feel ominous. In the months following Jacob's arrest, her department was flooded with calls from anxious homeowners, asking for property inspections. Eventually, a dedicated task force was created to examine homes built or renovated by Edmund Ravenswood. Over time, they found hidden spaces in 17 homes, some of which were so cleverly concealed that without Jacob's detailed maps, they would have never been found. The secret rooms were sealed, the hidden passages exposed, and they were either blocked off or incorporated into the home's regular floor plan. Ellen Ravenswood never returned to Silent Valley Road. She stayed with friends until finding a new home, one built from scratch, with concrete walls and no crawl spaces. Despite efforts to renovate and remove all traces of Edmund's work, the Ravenswood house remained abandoned for years, its reputation preventing it from being sold. In 2019, 3 years after Jacob's arrest, Isabella was summoned to the jail, where Jacob was awaiting transfer to a state facility after his appeals. He had requested to meet with her personally, claiming he had crucial information. There are others, Jacob told Isabella when they met face-to-face in the visitation room. Edmund had students besides me. We never all met, but we know of each other. He paused, his words deliberate, dark. We're like a family, scattered across the country. Some of us build the spaces, some use them, some of us do both. When Isabella pressed for more specifics, Jacob only revealed fragments. Look at homes built between 1965 and 1979. Check for the symbol, a small triangle inside a circle, usually carved under a basement beam or beneath a windowsill. That's how we mark them. That's how we know which houses have eyes, he added, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella launched an investigation into Jacob's cryptic claims, but turned up little evidence to support a wider network. The symbol only appeared one more time, in the carved inscription on Edmund Ravenswood's headstone in the county cemetery. An architectural review of homes from that period yielded no new findings. Yet something about Jacob's certainty stuck with Isabella. During the trial, Jacob had never minimized his actions or sought leniency. He had admitted everything, provided maps, journals, and gave detailed accounts of his crimes, accepting his punishment without hesitation. Why would he fabricate something now? Her unanswered question lingered until 6 months later, when Isabella received a call from a sheriff in eastern Washington. They had arrested a man living in the walls of a suburban home. The man was found with a journal that mirrored Jacob's, detailing the surveillance of a family over an 18-month period. Hidden in the basement windowsill, investigators discovered the same symbol, a small triangle inside a circle. Isabella immediately set up a specialized team trained to identify hidden architectural spaces. They've since worked with law enforcement across 7 states, helping uncover similar cases. At least 23 instances have been documented across the Great Plains, all following the same disturbing pattern: secret watchers hidden in plain sight. Edmund Ravenswood's architectural drawings and journals were donated to the County Historical Society after Ellen's parents passed. They sat in the archives, untouched, until Jacob's arrest sparked an investigation. But when officials went to retrieve the materials, they discovered that someone had checked them out 3 years earlier, and never returned them. The signature on the checkout card was illegible. Isabella still gets calls from concerned residents who believe someone is spying on them. She no longer dismisses these claims, no matter how outlandish they seem. Her advice has evolved since her early days on the job, and she now tells people, look up. Look at the spaces between the walls. Pay attention to the places you normally ignore. And if you find a small triangle inside a circle anywhere in your home, call me immediately. Most of the calls lead nowhere. But occasionally, in older homes with complicated histories, investigators find evidence of hidden spaces, places where someone could observe unseen, listen through vents, and record the private lives of those who thought they were safe. The walls have eyes, the houses listen, and sometimes the spaces between them are occupied by those who believe watching others is their right. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time!